Alrighty, welcome back to our final session, sadly, of our Profiles in Courage class with Rabbi Barry L. Schwartz. I don't need to intro Barry anymore, I think. Hopefully, if you've missed sessions, you've caught up by watching some of the recordings. If you're not receiving recordings, I'll put my email in the chat as usual, and you can let me know if you have any issues or any questions. Of course, thread your questions for Schwartz throughout, and we will fit them in sometime at the end. And yeah, let's take advantage of this last time we have together. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Gabe, and good afternoon to everyone. Although I see already we have some viewers from Europe, so we say good evening to them. We may have some viewers from the West Coast, who knows? We say good morning to you. Thank you once again for being here from in New Jersey. The weather has been gorgeous each time we've given this presentation, and so the fact that anybody shows up makes me happy when you could be outside doing something else as well. Today, we're going to conclude what I describe as our lightning tour of American Jewish history and Profiles in Courage. I was mentioning to Gabe that at my own synagogue, we're taking an entire semester, maybe even longer than that, to cover a course like this and are able to go into greater depth. But you do have the ability to read a very enjoyable, not enjoyable in the sense of the subject matter, but in terms of the ease of reading in the book, Saying No to Hate, Overcoming Anti-Semitism by Norman H. Finkelstein. And this session, we're once again going to move rapidly from the eve of the Second World War to the present day. For those who might not have been here, our first session began in 1654 and went up to the pre-Civil War era. And then last week, we went from the pre-Civil War era to the pre-World War II era, when we looked up particularly at the interesting case of Uriah Phillips Levy and his one-man attempt to combat anti-Semitism in the United States Navy and beyond. We looked at Grant's infamous order expelling the Jews and how the Jewish community from Paducah, Kentucky to across the United States mobilized and appealed to Abraham Lincoln to overturn that order, which he did on the spot in front of the Jews that were able to get an audience with him. Imagine being in the room with Lincoln when he said, "We won't tolerate this." And then finally, we talked about the unknown hero Aaron Sapiro, who helped lead the fight against Henry Ford and his notorious anti-Semitism. And here I want to make a point that will carry us directly into our session today. What was so insidious about Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, besides the fact that he was an American icon, if you will? Part of what made it so problematic was because of his mouthpiece, the Dearborn Independent. Henry Ford was able to mobilize the media in a new way to spread his disinformation and his hateful rhetoric. And we're going to see that that's characteristic of anti-Semitism in America in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. His voice, unfortunately, was amplified by the use of media. Remember, I told you, he required all his franchise owners of Ford dealerships to distribute the Dearborn Independent. That might have gone on even longer if it wasn't for the brave actions of Sapiro and others in threatening what would have been a long and embarrassing media trial against Henry Ford, and he began to change his tune. But there was another individual shortly thereafter that utilized the media, and that's where we're going to begin today. And I'd like to unexpectedly begin this session with an excerpt, a quote from a book that I took a look at as I was preparing this course, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, published in 2019 by Bari, B-A-R-I, Weiss, who is a well-known conservative Jewish commentator. Today, you may remember when she resigned from the New York Times, it was something of a brouhaha. But she writes in the first chapter of her book, and I quote, "I've always considered myself among the luckiest Jews in all of history." And I want to just comment there that perhaps before the end of the session, I can make a few comments about the success story of the American Jewish community, because we're looking at the underside in battling anti-Semitism. But ironically, some of the anti-Semitism may come because of the success of the American Jewish community, and it is something to behold. So she goes on, "This would be true if I had been born in America after the mid-century. These were the years of plenty for Jewish Americans, the hospitals and law firms Jews had built because they'd been shut out of the others were now the ones everyone was clamoring to join. The consummate outsiders had in mere decades become the insiders, capable of advocating not just for themselves, but also for those still facing systemic discrimination. That I had lived in the United States at this time is a matter of incredible luck or blessing, depending on your belief in the otherworldly. But the reality I inherited was not a happy accident." What does she mean by this? Bari Weiss goes on to say, "Most Americans my age do not know the name Charles Coughlin. But in the 1930s, 30 million Americans would tune in every week to listen to the priest who defended Kristallnacht and who said of the Jews, 'We have lived to see the day that modern Shylocks have grown fat and wealthy, praised and deified, because they have perpetrated the ancient crime of usury unto the modern racket of statesmanship.' Coughlin was so influential that his own town in Michigan had to build a new post office just to keep up with the nearly 80,000 letters sent to him each week." We will say more about Coughlin momentarily, but the fact that if you ask a new generation of Jewish Americans or Americans, who was this person, they won't know. My father, of blessed memory, had personal memory of hearing Coughlin on the radio. People of a certain generation inescapably knew who he was. And then, interestingly enough, Bari Weiss goes on to say, Henry Ford, who of course we talked about last week, received a personal shout out in Mein Kampf and was awarded in 1938 the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Nazis granted to any foreigner. Did you know that about Henry Ford? Hitler, who owned a portrait of Ford, had been deeply inspired by the automaker's passionate Jew hatred, which was regularly articulated in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. In 1939, and we will talk about this a little bit more today too, 1939, half a year before Hitler invaded Poland, more than 20,000 people showed up at Madison Square Garden to rally for the Nazi cause, with banners declaring, "Wake up America, smash Jewish communism, and stop Jewish domination of Christian Americans." 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden. Bari Weiss goes on to make the point that European anti-Semitism actually learned from American anti-Semitism and vice versa. She goes on to say, "A large measure of the American Jewish freedom I have enjoyed was a reaction to what happened in the bloodlands of Europe. The post-war liberal America that rose as the Nazis fell became a fairer place to live for Jews because of the lessons that the world, that America specifically learned only after the murder of 6 million. So we will be thinking about that as we go on to discuss what happened in the 20th century and whether, in fact, we have all learned the lessons that we should in this regard. So with that, we're going to turn to that pre-war era that I spoke about, and begin with an organization that you might not have heard about. And it was responsible for filling up Madison Square Garden. The American Bund, B-U-N-D, and a group called the Silver Shirts were responsible for the anti-American sentiment that grew so loudly. In the 1930s, Italy had its black shirts, Germany had its brown shirts, and the United States had its silver shirts, writes our author Norman Finkelstein. He had allies in America, Hitler did, that were approval of the fascist tendencies that had been building at that time. But the 1930s also saw the technological advance of new ways to reach a national audience, in this case, radio. A Catholic priest named Father Charles Coughlin recognized its potential to bring his message into American homes. Initially a Roosevelt supporter, Coughlin became disillusioned when he did not gain access to the administration, and he began rallying against Roosevelt and the New Deal. His agenda also included isolationism, anti-communism, opposition to banking, and later anti-Semitism. From Royal Oak, Michigan, at his church, the National Shrine of the Little Flower, he attracted as many as 40 million listeners at its peak. In 1938, he ignited two controversies. First, he drew the ire of the Jewish press for reprinting the already discredited Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion in his newspaper, ironically called Social Justice. So remember, Ford reprinted this infamous, notorious anti-Semitic tract, and now Coughlin did. Then he incited an even larger debate for his response to the Kristallnacht pogrom in Germany. You know, or should know about Kristallnacht. Father Coughlin minimized it by claiming that the Nazis were only acting to combat the spread of communism, which he closely associated with the Jews from spreading in Germany. His comments were so vicious that one major radio station in New York refused to air his next broadcast, but most stations continued to transmit his show. Where did his base of support come from? According to Finkelstein, it came from working class, largely Irish Catholics in large cities joining others who feared communism and then were led to be suspicious of Jews. An organization called the Christian Front drew support from Coughlin's followers and moved incitement from the airways to the streets. Front members hawked copies of his Social Justice, distributed leaflets urging shoppers to buy only from Christian-owned stores, and went on the attack, assaulting Jews and people they thought looked Jewish. Yes, this was happening in America in the late 1930s into the early 40s. Sympathetic Irish Catholic police officers sometimes took the hooligans' side and let the assaults continue without interruption. In 1939 and 1940, New Yorkers experienced 40 to 50 raucous Christian Front street meetings at which crowds had been exhorted to liquidate the Jews in America. They moved on from New York with 12,000 followers to Philadelphia, where they broke synagogue windows and terrorized Jews on the streets. In New York and Boston, roving gangs of this group attacked young Jews in heavily Jewish neighborhoods. In Minneapolis, his supporters distributed leaflet warnings that Jews were planning to rule the world. Historian Oscar Hanlon estimated at least 4 million and perhaps as many as 10 million Americans enlisted in such organizations as the Silver Shirts and the Christian Front and the Ku Klux Klan. Side by side with that, as I mentioned earlier, it was in 1936 that the German-American Bund was formed primarily by Americans of German ancestry. And for all intents and purposes, it looked like a mirror image of the German Nazi Party. On February 20th, 1939, the Bund held a giant Americanism rally in New York City's Madison Square Garden. There's actually a photo of it in the book. I don't have the image with me this morning. You should know that outside of Madison Square Garden, a crowd of more than 25,000 demonstrators opposed what was going on inside Madison Square Garden. There's also a photo in the book of Rabbi Stephen S. Wise addressing those individuals as well. So we have, following in the footsteps of Henry Ford, a priest who seems to have made a national career out of his anti-Semitic diatribes, which were broadcast to millions via the technology of the radio at that time. And then I just want to add one more. You might call it the trifecta of high-profile American anti-Semites at this time. Henry Ford's number one. Charles Coughlin is number two. And you know who the third is? Another American hero, another American icon who did great damage through his anti-Semitism. And I'm talking about Charles Lindbergh, the American aviator hero. This is what Finkelstein has to say. When World War II broke out in Europe on September 1st, 1939, the United States adopted an officially neutral position toward Germany and England. I don't know if you realize that, but American neutrality was its first response. Since 1933, Roosevelt's position had been to maintain friendly diplomatic and trade relations with Nazi Germany. And until Kristallnacht in 1938, he never publicly criticized Hitler's persecution of the German Jews. When asked in 1938, public opinion poll, if persecution of Jews in Europe had been the fault of Jews themselves, 55% of Americans polled answered yes, entirely or partly. Every politician is sensitive to public opinion. Public opinion at this point was not favorably disposed toward the Jews of Europe or the Jews of the United States. There was a new documentary that aired just before the Olympics this summer about the debate regarding America's participation in the 1936 Olympics. As you know, America did participate. And its two Jewish track athletes were, in the end, barred from participating, even though they had flown in as part of the team. Well, A year later, in 1940, a new organization was established, and its name, the America First Committee. Does that have some resonance with what's happening in our country now? Are you aware of the fact that the America First philosophy of today and the actual language is directly appropriated from this period in American history? It was created to defend American isolationism and lobby against any American military support of foreign countries. The committee grew into a national membership of 800,000. Roosevelt haters, German-American Bundists, Christian fronters, assorted anti-Semites. You can be sure that Henry Ford and Charles Coughlin and the supporters were behind this too. They chose as their leading spokesman Charles Lindbergh. Of course, in 1924, Lucky Lindy had become the first person to fly across the Atlantic, became an American hero for his feat. Well, did you know that he visited Germany in 1938? And Hermann Göring awarded him a Nazi medal on behalf of Hitler? By 1940, late 1940 to 41, Lindbergh was traveling across the United States, a barnstorming tour, delivering anti-war speeches to huge crowds and radio broadcasts that reached millions. In a nationally broadcast speech in Des Moines, Iowa, on September 11th, 1941, he said, "The three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jews, and the Roosevelt administration." He went on to say regarding the Jews, quote, "Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence of our motion pictures, our press, our radio, our government. And for reasons which are not American, they wish to involve us in war." Lindbergh went on to threaten that if the Jews did not stop agitating for war, they will be among the first to feel its consequences. In the same way that the American Jewish community itself and rallying support from people of good faith around the country combated anti-Semitism prior to this, it was difficult, but they took on Charles Lindbergh. In the age now of media, one of their tactics was to get radio stations and American newspapers to editorialize against Lindbergh. Some said yes, some said not. They also tried to rally the Roosevelt administration with not any particular success. Of course, you may know about The Plot Against America, the haunting book by Philip Roth. It takes as its foundation the fact that America First and Lindbergh would win the next election, and he writes a deeply troubling counter history. If you haven't read that book, or even if you have, to read it now in light of other events in our country is to see how prescient Philip Roth was in what could happen in our country. As early as 1933, American Jews, especially under the leadership of Stephen Wise, did rally, did protest against the rise of Nazism and the rise of anti-Semitism and Nazi sympathizers here. While we might have had some greater success in putting anti-Semites in their place, or at least limiting their damage here, Europe was a different story, and the Second World War and the Holocaust would unfold. So now, before I go on and fast forward from the end of the World War II into the 1960s and the civil rights period, any essential questions or comments I'll ask Gabe concerning the period that involved Coughlin, Henry Ford before him, Charles Lindbergh after him, and the American Bund, German-American Bund Party, and the like.
No, give me 1 second. Well, still some people are tying that to today. So I think at the end of the class, we'll tie some things to today. The book that he mentioned is called The Plot Against America. I put a link in about it. There's also a fantastic HBO miniseries that differs a bit from the book, but is also very chilling. I would ask you quickly, are there any figures from that movement against Lindbergh and Coughlin who stand out? You mentioned Stephen Wise. Are there a couple other names who were particularly prominent at that time in standing up?
There were a group of individuals who were standing up to anti-Semitism, even as they were helping the nascent movement to create a Jewish state in Palestine, early Zionist. And so some of the same people, ranging from prominent American rabbis to groups like the Bergson Boys and others, they played a dual role. And it's interesting that that they were involved in both ways, because certain Jews had begun to see that anti-Semitism was so endemic in Europe that a radical solution would have to play out. And I just want to quote from you, because I happen to have it in my notes here. At the end of the 20th century, a man named Theodor Herzl, a name you know so well, he wrote, "We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, of her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors have not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country. If we were left in peace, but I think we shall never be left in peace." So you can see that the anti-Semitism in Europe led what was still a minority, but a strong-minded minority, to say that the only radical action is to plan and make reality a Jewish state. Well, there were Zionist backers. They may have felt that way about Herzl, but they also felt that for the vast community remaining here, as it did in Europe, that we would have to take on anti-Semitism even as we created a Jewish state. So Stephen Wise, who I mentioned before, was both standing strong against anti-Semitism, but a strong Zionist. Same with Abba Hillel Silver. Same with Balfour and Brickner. These are some of the great orators and leaders of the American Jewish community. They came from all denominations. There were those who did not support a Jewish state, who also raised their voices against anti-Semitism. So these are some of the people who accomplished a great deal, although ultimately they could not urge the United States administration to take a stronger stand against the anti-Semitism in Europe. Anything
Great.
else, Gabe?
No, not on this. Let's leave 5 or 10 minutes at the end to go over um, sort of the roots of all these anti-Semitic tropes. Get very broad and let's give people a 5 minute primer at the end if
Yes,
you're if you're
we certainly will do that. And in the interest of time, I also want to say that we can't delve into the civil rights movement as much as I would like to, other than to make the point that in fighting for the civil rights of African Americans, which the Jewish community did in outsized proportion to its numbers, we were also fighting the fight against discrimination of any kind, including anti-Semitism. So when you look at the white leaders of the civil rights movement, from Jack Greenberg, who worked so importantly with Thurgood Marshall, to the Freedom Riders, who went down to Mississippi and other places in the early 1960s, the proportion of Jews was remarkable. And what I'm saying is that there was an interest in fighting discrimination, anti-Semitism, as well as racism of any kind. You have the famous friendship of one of my personal heroes, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and the iconic photo of him marching with Martin Luther King. There were a core of other rabbis from the Reform movement, the conservative movement in particular, that marched with King. My own rabbi, growing up in Westchester County in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, Michael Robinson of blessed memory, left a convention of rabbis in 1964 when Martin Luther King said, "Come down to St. Augustine. We are protesting, but we expect to be jailed." He and 17 other rabbis left the convention, flew down to St. Augustine, and indeed protested and were arrested and spent a night in jail. They were released the next day, and that day happened to be remarkable because Congress, this is in 1964, July 2nd, passed the Civil Rights Act, which most people do not know. The drafts of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that followed, the drafts of these landmark documents, do you know where they were written? At the Social Action Center of the Reform Movement, called the RAC, the Religious Action Center, in Washington, D.C., as a result of the alliance of Jews and African Americans at that time. They were drafted in that conference room with legendary Black leaders such as A. Philip Randolph and Roy Wilkins, with the help of remarkable Jewish leaders like Kivi Kaplan. So the civil rights movement advanced the fight against racism of all kinds. As you know, it was endemic in this country, and that fight is still ongoing. But for the purposes of bringing ourselves to the present, I can only mention one other incident that occurred a decade later in the 70s. It may have been forgotten, but it shouldn't be, especially in light of what we're facing right now. And what I'm referring to now is the infamous United Nations resolution of November of 1975. The Zionism is racism resolution, because the echoes of that have come back to haunt us. In November 1975, due in large support, now I'm reading from Finkelstein again, from Arab and Soviet bloc countries, the United Nations Resolution number 3379, equating with Zionism with racism, passed by a vote of 72 to 35, with 32 abstentions, mainly from Western countries. Referencing various other anti-Zionist statements, the official resolution declared that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. The entirety of the resolution is in the book, but I will just note that the last line says, this resolution determines that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. That perverted logic, unfortunately, has sunk deep into certain circles, even academic circles, as we know, and has reared its ugly head again. The resolution itself was repealed by the United Nations, I believe, sometime in the 90s, but the damage had already been done. One of the people who spoke out vigorously from Israel was Chaim Herzog. Another person who spoke out vigorously from the United States, America's ambassador, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose name may be familiar, especially if you come from New York, who stated memorably, quote, "A great evil has been loosened upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction by the United Nations." The last thing I'll say about the Zionism is racism resolution is that the United States American Jewish community once again mobilized allies. State and local governments were asked to decry the passage of the resolution. Many of them did, and such groups as the National Education Association and the League of Women Voters did so. Catholic and Protestant clergy from 21 states sent the UN Secretary General a statement calling the resolution, quote, "a revival of all too familiar anti-Semitism, which has plagued mankind throughout the centuries. It is, moreover, a falsehood without historical justification." If we had time, we would look to the rest of the 1970s, where a march by Nazi sympathizers in Skokie, targeting the large Jewish population of Skokie, Illinois, attracted national media attention. But we need to fast forward as we come down to the last 20 minutes of our session to the 21st century and what has happened in the last now 2.5 decades. We know that September 11th, which we recently commemorated the 23rd anniversary of, awakened Americans to the great prejudice of terrorism. But as with other calamities, including October 7th, anti-Semitism was in the mix in various distorted ways, from the anti-Semitism of the Islamic fundamentalists who perpetrated 9/11 and who beheaded Daniel Pearl, the American Jewish journalist of blessed memory, to other conspiracy theorists emanating from disparate sources who blamed 9/11 on the American Jewish community. We saw in the early 2000s the rise of the BDS movement, boycott, diversity, sanctions, and I'm mentioning these because they all contribute to the undercurrent of anti-Semitism, which burst anew after October 7th, as we'll comment upon momentarily. And then we had the Tree of Life massacre of Jews in Pittsburgh, which occurred 6 years ago already in 2018, and other individual acts of anti-Semitism. But that brings me to the present, and I will I'll say a few words here, and then we will have an opportunity to speak further as well, and recognize that this book was completed before October 7th happened. But I do want to quote two things to you. The first is from the very end of the book, where we introduced an editorial note. We say that first on the good news, Jews found themselves in the boardrooms of American leading corporations at the helm of the country's Ivy League universities, talking about the 21st century now. Jews were visible in sports, entertainment, literature, and the arts. In political service, as in many other fields, they have often greatly exceeded their percentage of the American population. In 2023, there were 8 Jewish members of the United States Senate, while the total Jewish population hovered at about 2%. In the year 2000, Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut became the Democratic Party nominee for Vice President of the United States. And as the first Jew on any major political party's presidential ticket, he could say anything is possible in America. And then, as you know, in 2021, when Kamala Harris became vice president, her Jewish husband, Doug Emhoff, became the first second gentleman of the United States. And then our editorial update. After Hamas's massacre in Israel on October 7th and the Israel-Hamas war that immediately followed, the Anti-Defamation League reported that anti-Semitic incidents in America reached the highest number of incidents during any 2-month period since ADL began tracking in 1979. So understand, anti-Semitism spiked in America within weeks, if not months, of October 7th. Now, in the spring, I was at a conference in New York, and I heard Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, say, we don't just have a rise. He said, we have a tsunami. That's the word he used, a tsunami of anti-Semitism in this country since October 7th. Just between October 7th and December 7th, and this is already old news because this was already the end of last year, ADL recorded a total of 2,031 anti-Semitic incidents, up by 456 incidents from the same period the year before. That's a 337% increase. And another study found that in just the first 3 weeks after October 7th, social media websites were inundated with instances of Holocaust inversion, with the memory of the Holocaust being weaponized, explicitly comparing Israel with Nazi Germany and equating its justified acts of self-defense in the Gaza Strip with genocide. That leads me to a final point now on our contemporary situation, having looked at this, this historically. What we see and hear, I would venture, is the tip of the iceberg. Because for every bit of loud anti-Semitism, as I call it, there's a whole lot of what I would term quiet anti-Semitism. If you would allow me to briefly quote from one of my blogs. You can find it at the blog, my blog space that Gabe had told us about, had given in the chat at the Times of Israel at the first session. I called this one the banality of anti-Semitism, and this is how I began. Hannah Arendt wrote famously about the banality of evil. She was referring to how ordinary people could perpetrate extraordinary evil. Her ideas arose from her witnessing of Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem. Bureaucrats could be Nazis. Your next-door neighbor could be their sympathizer and your betrayers. They could also acquiesce by their silence. Today, we are witnessing a new chapter in the banality of anti-Semitism, not the overt, violent anti-Semitism of terrorists, although we have that, but the covert, quiet anti-Semitism of intellectuals and their accomplices. Not the classic anti-religious and racist tropes of the past, but the novel vilification of Jews and the Jewish state as persecutors. This new doctrine is a deceptively toxic brew of half-truths, misdirections, revisionism, and willful ignorance. Noah Feldman, the professor at Harvard, puts it, the core of this new anti-Semitism lies in the idea that Jews are not a historically oppressed people seeking self-preservation, but instead oppressors, imperialists, colonialists, and even white supremacists. The new anti-Semitism has been lying just below for some time, sporadically bubbling up to the surface in the guise of anti-Zionism, as we saw earlier. Then it exploded in one of the great ironies of our time after October 7th. As heinous as the Hamas attacks were, straight-faced academics and protesters alike intoned that Israel is not innocent, etc., etc. Well, here's my Je Accuse, which was the name of the tract that Emile Zola wrote after witnessing the anti-Semitism of the Alfred Dreyfus trial. My Je Accuse is simple and direct. I don't know if all of you will agree with it, but I'll put it out there. If you deny Israel's right to exist, you are an anti-Semite. Not just an anti-Zionist, but an anti-Semite. If you deny Israel's right to self-defense, you are an anti-Semite. If you fail to condemn the evil of Hamas, you are an anti-Semite. If you tacitly support those who want to eradicate Israel, you're still an anti-Semite. If you distort history to fit only your anti-Zionist narrative, you are still an anti-Semite. And if you remain silent with regard to all this, you are on your way to becoming an anti-Semite. Permit me to conclude by quoting the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who wrote that anti-Semitism is the paradigm of irrational hatred. He says that when hate is rational, which it can be in some cases, because it's based on a certain fear or disapproval that justified or not has some logic to it, then it can be reasoned with, presumably brought to an end. But unconditional, irrational hatred cannot be reasoned with. There's nothing one can do to address it, and it persists. So we do have to distinguish between, if you will, those for whom you can reason with and those for whom you cannot reason with. And he said that in the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, spreading the plague, and in one of the most absurd claims ever, the blood libel, they were suspected of killing Christian children to use their blood. It was evidently impossible, but that did not stop people from believing it. But then listen to what he says about the Enlightenment, because don't we consider the United States to be the epitome of the enlightened nation? He said, the European Enlightenment, with its worship of science and reason, was expected to end all such hatred. Instead, it gave rise to a new version of it, racial anti-Semitism. In the 19th century, Jews were hated because they were rich and because they were poor, because they were capitalist and because they were communist, because they were exclusive and kept to themselves, and because they infiltrated everywhere, because they were believers in an ancient superstitious faith, and because they were rootless cosmopolitans who believed in nothing. Anti-Semitism, he said, was the supreme irrationality of the age of reason. Despite the American success story, of which we could do a whole wonderful course about that as well, what we have seen in this mini course is irrational anti-Semitism rearing its head, xenophobia, and ancient hatreds bubbling up to the surface time and again. And so we need to remain vigilant. We need to raise our voices and mobilize media and allies. And we need to vote in a democracy. I call it the 3V strategy. And so it's something that I'll be preaching about at greater length in my own synagogue at these upcoming high holidays. But vigilance, voice, and vote, I think, is the call of this hour as we continue in our quest to enjoy the blessings of the most successful Jewish diaspora community in history, but remain alert to those who would take away those blessings. Thank you. At this point, we have about 7 or 8 minutes to consider some questions and comments about either our contemporary situation or any of the historical pieces we looked at in the course. So I will turn to our moderator.
Thank you, Rabbi Schwartz. That was fantastic. And just first off, thank you for the course and doing such a lightning tour, like you said, covering so much ground very elegantly. There's a lot in there. First off, there are questions. What was the title of that blog post, the last blog post you were citing from? Is it what did October 7th change?
That's a different one. It's the banality of anti-Semitism.
Okay, I don't see that one on the Times of Israel, strangely. So maybe you could send it along.
Okay. Yes, I will get it on that blog post if it's not there. Yes.
Okay. Let's see. We have some specific questions now. Back here. Why? Okay, so maybe we should start at the beginning because there are a bunch of questions from throughout ours. Can you give us a primer on a quick primer on, again, a big topic, but some of the tropes that you just mentioned there in passing, Jews being called communists, the blood libel. Are there some historical developments from way back that you could point to as the root of the protocols of the Elders of Zion? And a lot of people are expressing in the comments why the Jews, is it just because they were of different religion? Are there ethnic differences going on? What are some, I know that's a huge topic, but what are some of the big roots of some of the big strains of anti-Semitism throughout history?
Unfortunately, in the modern era, who would have thought this could happen in the 21st century? You have the coming together of two wide and deep strains of anti-Semitism that have made it just when you thought that perhaps we could put this sordid history behind us. The first remains the anti-Judaism of the church, which goes back 2,000 years, combining with the anti-Jewish racial hatred, which actually became more and more virulent during the Enlightenment, when people tried to rationalize their fears and their prejudices. The two have always been intertwined, anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism of the racial kind. They have combined, and so while it's not unique to dislike a minority group, and we see we see racism against many different groups, even in the present. There seems to be a leftover, a hangover, if you will, of an anti-Semitism that is deeply racial in context. You can change your religion, you can't change who you are racially, even though the whole notion that the Jews are a race is a mistaken one. And then you add something else, Gabe, that I was just thinking about before this class, and that is you can't discount the fact that people harbor deep resentments against other people who are either different or who they're jealous of. Jealousy is a deep-seated human emotion. So is resentment. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the last of the 10 Commandments and involved in so many other Torah teachings about not coveting, not being jealous, and not resenting. And so the success of the American Jewish community, the high-profile success in many cases, I think adds to this toxic brew, if you will. We didn't have time to talk about it, but I have a list of prominent Jews in 10 different fields of endeavor, covering all aspects of modern life. And the list is incredibly long, of Nobel Prize winners and pioneers and this and that. And so we see in America today the politics of resentment, and an offshoot of that is resentment against what could arguably make the case for the most successful minority group in America. So deep-seated anti-Judaism, racially motivated anti-Semitism, and the politics of resentment, they all come together. That's the best answer on one foot I can give.
Thank you. Yeah. There's so many more really big things here. I wonder if we close with one. And Rabbi, are you open to maybe a couple of questions over email if people didn't get their questions?
Definitely. I've given my email before. I've received some very nice emails, some people inquiring about utilizing the book in their own teaching. And you can reach me once again at bschwartz@jps.org.
Great. Maybe to end on the very contemporary issue, one person asked, so how do people get to saying Zionism is racism? I know that could be an entire class, but is there a reason that you think that has held on maybe so long?
The far left, which is responsible, unfortunately, for so much of especially the quiet anti-Semitism, and with the protests, not so quiet anti-Semitism, has become obsessed with racism, and in a cataclysmic inversion, sees Zionists as racist and feels they must call it out. We, in turn, need to decry anti-Semitism from the left and from the right. I wrote a letter when I saw an absolutely inadequate response to October 7th to an organization that I have supported not for years, but for decades. It's often considered the best refugee organization in the world, the International Rescue Committee, founded by Albert Einstein. Well, let me tell you, I think Albert Einstein would be turning over in his grave if he saw the banality of the IRC and Amnesty International and other organizations to the anti-Semitism that is emerging from the left as well as the right. So as part of the vigilance and raising of the voices, we need to call it out wherever it comes from. And the last thing I will say is there's always what we can do to strengthen our own community and others through education. So I'm about to start my confirmation class this Sunday with the teenagers in my synagogue. I put aside what I thought we were going to do. The first few weeks is going to be a mini course on the history of modern Israel because they need it. The second part will be a mini history of anti-Semitism in America, like we just did in this class, because they need it. So when you have the opportunity to support education about Israel and about anti-Semitism, that too is part of raising our voices.
Thank you, Rabbi Schwartz. I will send around Rabbi Schwartz's email and our follow-up email along with the recording. So I know there are some meaty questions I didn't get to. Hopefully you got great, you learned some things about people you didn't know, names you didn't know, some names you did, because I did. I'm sure you all took away something different and important from this class. And we're really grateful that you were able to put together for us. One last thing I wanted to point out also is that Jewish Telegraphic Agency, JTA, which is partner site of My Jewish Learning, one of their reporters did a really in-depth podcast on Father Coughlin. It got picked up by PBS and Tablet and all kinds of things. So I'm going to put that in too. I want you to keep an eye out for that. It's a really good in-depth discussion if you were intrigued and didn't know that name. So I think we have to wrap up, sadly. Thanks again, Rabbi Schwartz. This class will live on through the book that you used as your source material and many other texts that we've talked about. Any parting words you want to leave us with? So maybe Shana Tova or Shana Tova.
Thank you to you, Gabe. Thank you to everyone, and Shana Tova to everybody. A good year. Let's hope a year that brings more peace. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye all.